Two extremely similar cameras, yet so different. If you're on the edge between the two, you gotta know. I'm Team APSC, and in this video I want to show you through my own experience and couple of experiments that a new generation APS-C camera like Sony A6700 is good enough for most users. Hey, don't get me wrong, there is no doubt that the full frame cameras are generally better. And if you are a professional who's looking for truly the best in class, full frame is your way. But for casual photographers, videographers, hybrid shooters, small-time YouTubers, hear me out guys. Pair your A6700 with a nice lens with good skills and you'll be surprised how much of a powerhouse the A6700 actually is for the $1,300 price tag. Low light performance, bokeh, sharpness, we'll check all of that side by side, friends. By the looks, these two cameras are almost identical. Weighs roughly the same, size is roughly the same, except that the grip is better for 6700. It's a bit bigger and more comfortable. The button placement is identical too, with mode selector on top, record button, as well as identical layout on the back of the camera. The only two differences are the way photo video selector works for A7C II and that it has another wheel here, while A6700 doesn't have this wheel, but has one more custom button here compared to A7C II. Another minor difference in looks is that A7C II comes in various colors like this very nice dual tone, while A6700 always comes black. Articulating screen, viewfinder placement, the resolution and all the ports on the side are absolutely identical. There's only one SD card slot, micro HDMI and other ports, both are weather sealed, both has IBIS, although A7C II has better IBIS, we'll test that in a moment. Same battery and generally so many similarities, but let's see the main difference, full frame versus APS-C, and what it actually means for low light performance and image quality. So, the sensor size on A7C II is much bigger. This does mean better low light performance. How much better? Let's test photos first. Starting with the ISO 100 and increasing by one stop, as well as punching into 100% in this area with the wall, so you see how much noise each camera produces. So what I noticed is that A7C II is about one stop better, if you will. It seems like A6700's ISO 800 is somewhat on par with A7C II's ISO 1600. And generally, it's up to you to decide what noise level is acceptable. For me, ISO 1600 is acceptable for A6700, while A7C II still looks good at ISO 3200. It's a lot of numbers here. But check it out, not only hardware, also software develops, and now in Lightroom you can easily convert this noisy ISO 6400 image to something like this. That's pretty cool, right? Okay, let's do videos. First, both cameras have dual native ISO, and some say A6700's second base ISO is crappy. Let's test it. I'm shooting S-Log3 with S-Cine Gamma 3, and what you see on the screen is footage converted to Rec 709 in Premiere Pro automatically. No LUTs are applied. I'm shooting 24 frames per second and highest quality / bitrate. I'm also punching into 300% here, so you see more clearly the noise. At first base ISO 800, the full-size image looks clean for both cameras, but I noticed that A6700 has a bit more noise compared to A7C II in that 300% zoomed in image. One very important thing to note here, guys. I exposed all of these shots with exposure 0, but I did that on purpose to accentuate the noise and make the difference more noticeable. Just to make sure I didn't screw up, I did the same exact test by exposing to the right, with meter being overexposed to 1.7, and both cameras performed exactly the same, but just with a bit less noise after the correction, obviously. So, if you are new to S-Log3 and you're shooting in S-Log3 with these cameras, remember to expose to the right and watch out for zebras. Okay, now let's see the second base ISO. For A6700 it is 2500, while A7C II has it at 3200. It is noticeable that both cameras introduce more noise at their second base ISO, while the full-size image remains clean. Doubling it to 6400 ISO, the A6700's footage starts to get quite noisy. The noise is also starting to be noticeable at the full-size image, while A7C II, you know what, it seems to be doing pretty well in my personal opinion. At 12,800, while the colors and contrast is still good, the A6700 footage is a no-go. Quite a strong distraction for me, while the A7C II is still perhaps usable, while noise is visible. 32,000, no, just no for both. Okay, just for fun, let's test the 4K 60. Wait. Before we do that, we need to speak about frame rates, bit rates, and crop factors, as this is something quite interesting. First of all, the similarities. Both cameras have the following file formats, and I personally shoot XAVC-HS 4K for most of my videos, as that gives the best compression, meaning great file size, good enough quality, and a frame rate. Here we are talking about 100 megabits at 24 frames per second and 422 10-bit, while 60 frames per second gives 200 megabit 422 10-bit. If I want highest quality possible, I switch to XAVC-SI 4K, and that gives me 240 megabits 422 10-bit, while 60 frames per second gives me whooping 600 megabits 422 10-bit. Again, both cameras are identical in this aspect, except two things. First, A6700 is superior, just kidding, because it allows shooting 4K 120 frames per second with the bitrate of 280 megabits 422 and 10-bit color. Take notes here, because I have to put the A7C II in an HD mode from 1995, then I can select the 120 frames per second, so HD, not 4K. And funny enough, it records 100 megabits with 420 8-bit color only. Things get a little more interesting when taking crop into equation. You see, A6700 shoots 4K up to 20 frames per second from a 6K capture without a crop, or tiny 1.04 times crop for 4K 60, while the A7C II crops 1.58 times already when shooting 4K 60. If the math is right, then A6700 uses all of its 26 megapixels when shooting 24 or 60 frames per second, while A7C II 33 megapixels gets kind of reduced to 14.7 as soon as it shoots 4K 60. But hold on, does that mean A6700 will be better when shooting 4K 60? Well, I actually had a talk with my friend ChatGPT to understand the relevance of megapixels in this situation, because A7S III has only 12 megapixels and it performs like crazy. So anyways, as far as I understand, to produce the 4K image you need only about 8.3 megapixels. So both cameras has enough to downsample their footage to 4K, even A7C II's 14 megapixels in crop mode. And in real life scenario, the difference won't be noticeable. In fact, A7C II should actually perform better because it's a full frame sensor. It has better low light performance and dynamic range due to larger individual pixels, even when used in the crop mode. Don't take my word for it. Let's see. 4K 60 on both cameras, ISO 800, which is base ISO, as you can see. A7C II is cropped in quite a bit, but honestly, I'm watching this over and over and I just can't tell, one is significantly better than the other. Seems quite equal to me. Second base ISO, which is 2500 for A6700 and 3200 for A7C II, well, I will leave it up to you guys to determine. Write it in the comments. What do you think? My guess, equal again. However, when both cameras are at 3200, it seems like A7C II has it a tiny bit better. 6400, I feel like A7C II is a bit cleaner. And 12,800 as well as 32,000 is just not much worth looking at them, as both of them are pretty bad. And finally, since A6700 shoots 4K 120, I just want to show you how much noise there is, because it does crop in 1.58 times, but not only that. At ISO 800, the image looks already noisy with the exposure meter being to 0. While the 4K 24 frames per second footage is still clean even when you expose to 0, at 4K 120, neutrally exposed footage, in my opinion, is absolutely unusable. So you must certainly overexpose and then crush the shadows and blacks, but you also need to be careful on how much you do it. Check it. I increased the exposure gradually in these examples and corrected the footage in post. And while you see less noise, notice how also the contrast and saturation goes away. There's a lot more to talk about, but what do we conclude from this test? In short, the A7C II, of course, as expected, has better low light performance and dynamic range thanks to its larger sensor, especially when shooting 4K 24 or 4K 30. It's ideal for semi-professional video work, particularly in challenging lighting conditions. On the other hand, the A6700 offers the flexibility of 4K 120 frames per second, but with more noticeable noise, particularly at higher ISOs, and somewhat similar performance when shooting 4K 60. So, if you need versatility in frame rates and bit rates and won't be shooting too much in low light, the A6700 is a solid choice. But for overall image quality and low light capabilities, especially when shooting 4K 24, the A7C II stands out. Photos. Okay, let's take a look at some actual photo examples. As mentioned earlier, Sony A7C II has the advantage of having the 33 megapixel sensor versus the 26 megapixels on A6700. But does that matter that much? Yes, no, and depends. Obviously, on both cameras, the images are super sharp and nice, and I personally find that even at this day and age, the 26 megapixels is enough, even if you're printing. However, if you are a heavy cropper, for example, doing bird photography, then of course it's nice to have that extra possibility to punch in even more. Are the images from A7C II sharper? Some say yes. Again, in real life, I did not notice that. I think that the choice of the lenses make a lot bigger difference. Autofocus. On paper, A7C II has a slight advantage. However, I've done plenty of tests and honestly, it's just not possible to tell the difference. So guys, I'm not gonna waste your time here. Continue shooting. Actually, A6700 has a bit of upper hand with 11 frames per second, while A7C II has 10 frames per second. This does drop to 7 and 6 respectively if you shoot compressed RAW, which is what I recommend. Speaking of file types, A7C II has upper hand here because it has more control of RAW file types, meaning it has 3 different lossless compressed sizes as well as uncompressed RAW. Again, no biggie because lossless compressed is enough. Speaking of bursts, let's hear the difference between the shutter sounds. By the way, unlike A7 IV, the A7C II is not able to shoot 1/8000 of a second with the mechanical shutter. It gets only 1/4000, just like most of the APS-C cameras and just like A6700. However, you can kindly ask both of these cameras to use electronic shutter and it will allow you to crank the shutter up to 1/8000 of a second, but no sound. Bokeh? That's something people say, yeah, but did you know there's lots of f1.2 prime lenses on APS-C that cost around 300 bucks? Yeah, so go wild. However, here are a few examples for you guys. I did test also the stabilization of these two cameras and had this little setup here. While you watch this side-by-side comparison, and before I reveal which is which, I just want to say that on paper again, A7C II is better with 7 stops of stabilization, while A6700 is rated to have 5 stops. In this test, I have set both cameras to standard stabilization, meaning only the IBIS works, and A6700 is on the left while A7C II is on the right. With the active stabilization, this is how it looks like. In my opinion, both cameras are performing so good, and I honestly have a hard time telling them apart. Regarding the overheating, I live in a very hot country and I've been shooting out in the sun with scorching heat, and while both cameras do get hot, especially if you shoot something like 4K 60 and with the highest 600 megabit bitrate, I still have not come to the point where camera shuts itself off. Neither of them. So it's safe to say in normal day use, you won't have to worry about that. Menu system is identical to both. There is some difference in numbers here on the top. I noticed there, but I was going through like all of the items and I just couldn't find what's missing. Nevertheless, I like the arrangement these cameras have. I love the quick custom favorite menu at the beginning, as well as this really nice overview. Price. Okay guys, important one. I said this before and I'll say it again. APS-C cameras are cheaper, but it's not just the camera that's less expensive. You also have to consider the cost of lenses, size of front element, how large filters you need to get, how heavy payload gimbals you need to buy, backpacks, and the list goes on. Concretely speaking, A6700 as of this time cost under $14,000. But check the latest price in the description. While A7C II goes for $2,200. That's quite a big difference. Comparatively, Sony A7 IV is just $100 more now and is, you know, so much more professional. Wait, let me just stop myself here and ask a question. Where does these cameras fit? I think it's a super important question and probably the most important part of this video. Because this is where things get very interesting and my subjectivity comes in. From the moment A7C II lineup was released, I really was not sure where exactly does this camera fit. It's essentially a travel camera, great, but for those needs, A6700 can do most of that casual shooting. Need a little more pro camera? Well, that's where the A7 IV comes in with those dual card slots, full-size HDMI and whatnot, and right now it's only about $100 more. A6700 on the other hand is that, you know, I see it as a perfect travel camera, perfect everyday hybrid content creator, photos, videos, whatever you throw at it camera. Need mad bokeh? Just get those f1.2 lenses. They are so cheap now from brands like Sony. And purely from my personal experience, I shoot with A6700 on daily basis. I shoot YouTube videos with, you know, these kind of talking head B-rolls. I shoot client work with it even, both for real estate photos, videos. It's my primary travel camera too. And honestly, I have never shot past that second ISO base of over 2500 ISO. And if I know I'm gonna shoot low light, I choose the fast prime like the Viltrox 27mm f1.2. I use my DJI Ronin 4 gimbal a lot for the stabilization or the rig when it's a more creative project. All in all, this camera does exactly what I need. When it doesn't, which is very, very rare, I choose the A7 IV. I told you I'm team APS-C, and if you have been on the edge, I promise A6700 will be a great choice. Guys, it took me like 3 freaking weeks to run all the tests, write conclusions, film and edit, so I would very much appreciate if you would hit that like button as a sign of thank you in case you found this video useful. Go out, get what you're getting, and keep on creating.